This training gives you, as an entrepreneur, a basic introduction to the circular economy. We aim to give you enough insight so that you can go back and identify key focus areas to grasp where to adapt as legislation tightens, and to give you some basic idea of where the opportunities are. If you get the main points from today's session, you will have understood principles that cover up to 80% of what you need to know. At the end, we offer suggestions for getting at those remaining 20%. For those of you working with entrepreneurs like municipal officers, policymakers, as well as accountants, this training gives you the basics. And at the end, we'll be able to offer you a range of specialized courses just for your particular areas. Now, when scientists look at the Earth, they see four main areas or spheres, each connected to each other. Let's sketch a simplified version. There's the lithosphere, which is the rock lying beneath our feet, except for the biosphere, that's the living layer, the soil, the vegetation, and most living things. There's the water, which is the aquasphere, and finally the air, the atmosphere. For the purposes of the circular economy, you need to know its two main cycles. Now, the first one is the biological nutrient cycle. Now, this cycle takes place in the biosphere. Living things die and decompose in this sphere. Being broken down into nutrients, they arise again as new organisms die and decompose and arise again. We ourselves are part of this layer. Now, when you think about it, this living layer or biosphere works extremely effectively. Urine and feces from animals, they're broken down by the organisms in the soil, and from there plants grow and they're eaten by animals, etc., etc. Now, these components of life, we like to call them biological nutrients, they're continuously building up and breaking down as part of this living layer. Notice that we depict the green biological nutrient cycle, showing the circular arrow going in and out of the biosphere. This cycle means that we're using biological nutrients. We simply put them back and nature takes care of them. Now, in contrast, the second cycle is that of technical nutrients. Now, they circulate in another sphere, which I like to call the technosphere, which is another word for man-made society. Now, the nutrients for this cycle come not from the biosphere but from the lithosphere in the form of minerals and metals, etc. Stone, for example. And this cycle does not take place in the lithosphere, note that, but it takes place in the technosphere. That makes the technosphere kind of a fifth sphere, the man-made one. Now, in the technosphere, there is no natural return of minerals to the lithosphere. So, in the ideal cycle, they are used and reused again. In the worst case, they end up dumped and irrecoverable somewhere, possibly in the lithosphere, but sometimes even in the biosphere. So ideally, nutrients entering the technosphere should stay there. To drive the technosphere, up until recently, the only way considered to do it was fossil fuel. This fossil fuel is extracted from the lithosphere and combusted, which releases carbon into the atmosphere. Now, this carbon in the atmosphere cannot be taken care of in the way carbon in the biosphere can. The change to the weather systems risks dangers of upsetting the balance of all the spheres, and the weather system in particular. Now, there are two other elements apart from carbon, and both technical and biological nutrients, they need special attention. Now, both will be covered by more and more legislation in the future. Understanding this, the basics of this, opens up business opportunity. Now the first one is phosphorus. To aid agriculture or industrial agriculture, vast quantities of phosphorus are mined each year and incorporated into chemical fertilizers. These enter the biosphere after being mined from rock. Where they accumulate in quantities too large for nature to take care of, they cause pollution in both soils and in aquatic environments. The functioning biological cycle ensures phosphorus is retained in the cycle in the amounts that the living system can manage. Now that means there is very little, near to zero, release of phosphorus into the atmosphere. Phosphorus has no place in water. The other nutrient is nitrogen. Nitrogen is released to the air as nitrous oxide as a result of combustion of fuels. And nitrogen is also captured back from the air to make chemical fertilizers and, as in the case of phosphorus, causes pollution in soils and water if it accumulates in amounts that the biosphere cannot take care of. If the biological cycle has biological nutrients, then the technical cycle has technical nutrients, but it's different. These nutrients could be called components, they could be parts, or they could be materials. Now, for the circular economy to work then, technical nutrients should be kept in the service of society and not released into the biosphere. But on the other hand, all biological waste from society is hugely beneficial and should be returned back to the natural biological cycle. Now, fossil fuels present a special challenge. The energy is needed to drive the technosphere, but the carbon, which is released mostly as carbon dioxide, puts the climate system at risk. You should also consider that fossil fuel is finite and will only be short-lived in the circular economy. So all investment plans, including your own, should take this into account. For the average entrepreneur, there are 3 areas you need to gain control of in your operations. In these areas, particularly where legislation will likely tighten, you need to identify and be prepared for where legislation will prevent virgin material use and input of fossil fuel, which is also virgin material. 2, it's where there's a mixing of biological and technical nutrients and where technical nutrients are disposed. And 3, the release of biological nutrients. Now let's go through this systematically. You'll need to identify firstly where technical nutrients enter your supply chain and identifies ways to avoid using virgin material. Now, where do the technical nutrients come from? Are they recycled or newly mined? Does your supply chain mix biological and technical nutrients so that you cannot separate them later? Secondly, you need to identify where fossil carbon in the form of fuel and chemicals enters your supply chain and identify the alternatives. Thirdly, where your supply chain emits nitrogen and carbon to the atmosphere and how to close those cycles. 4, where technical nutrients leave the supply chain and what the state is of their recoverability. So here you need to identify waste handling services purchased by your suppliers, yourself, or your customers. 5th, where phosphorus from rock enters the biological cycle in your supply chain. And number 6 is where the biological nutrients from the supply chain end up. Where is that? And ensure that they're returned in a sensible way back to the biosphere. Number 7, if and how nitrogen and phosphorus leak into the atmosphere. As you can see, the opportunities come from reducing material costs, waste handling costs, and giving customers a good conscience, as well as avoiding fines from non-compliance. As a quick checklist to make sure you've grasped the basics, There are three elements to have full control over: phosphorus, nitrogen and carbon. These are present in the two cycles, the biological and the technical. And be sure to memorize the four spheres: lithosphere, biosphere, aquasphere and atmosphere, and be aware of the technosphere. There are 7 entry and exit points you need to be fully aware of. For opportunities to see our upcoming training courses, if you're interested in economic and fiscal policy, we have a special coming up on that. This will explain where policy can effectively ensure that the cycle is closed in both cycles. Biomass municipality explains how to adapt the biological cycle in your municipality to ensure that fuel, fibre as well as food is supplied. Now, our training for accountants explains how to put the circular economy into the profit and loss and balance sheet as well as business plans. Or contact us for specific consulting assignments.